All right, it's 11. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming in to this panel about FOIA and schools. We have some great experts here that you're going to hear from over the next 50 minutes. Super excited for this. There's so much that goes on with FOIA and education and schools and anything having to do with kids. And that's particularly been true during COVID. There's a lot of data, a lot of information. And through all our various jobs, we've all had to use FOIA to put together stories or take a look at policies. And we're hoping to share some of that expertise here with you today. I'm going to introduce our great panelists in a second. My name is Nader Issa. I'm an education reporter at the Chicago Sun-Times. Been covering education here in Chicago for 2.5 years. And have really enjoyed it, done a lot of FOIA work. And so I'll be chiming into the conversation. But for the most part, it's going to be our three great panelists here. First, there's Sarah Karp. She covers education for WBEZ. Mila Koumpilova, who covers education for Chalkbeat Chicago. And Pavlyn Jankov, who is an education policy researcher for the Chicago Teachers Union. And so I don't know if either of the three of you want to take a second to introduce yourselves a bit more, and then we'll get into the sort of bulk of the panel. You can start with Sarah and go from there.
Sure. So as Nader said, my name is Sarah Karp. I work for WBZ. Prior to that, I spent a lot of time working for Catalyst Chicago, which was a publication that's sort of a precursor to Chalkbeat. All the way through, I've always done a lot of data analysis, and so I've used FOIA a lot to try to get information. I also, I think one thing that's very fun or fascinating about the education beat is that, sometimes, there's so many different types of things that you might be FOIAing, from data to contracts to everybody tries for emails and different types of correspondence. So there's a lot of information to try to get at. And, sometimes you're more successful than others. So.
I can go next. As Nader said, I cover education at Chalkbeat here in Chicago. We are a nonprofit news organization that just focuses on coverage of public education here in Chicago and in 7 or 8 other cities across the country. Before that, I spent my entire career as a journalist in the newspaper world, covering education, immigration, and other beats. And as Sarah pointed out, FOIA is really a key tool in our arsenal as education reporters that I use quite a bit.
Hey everyone, I'm Pavlyn, and I work for the Chicago Teachers Union. I've been with them for going on 11 years now. So also been immersed in the public school education data world for quite some time. And yeah, FOIAs are pretty critical. I think there's so much information that we both look through from what's publicly available, and then also being the union, there's information we seek and get, and sometimes have to fight for, sort of through our relationship with the employer. But many times we still do have to rely on, the public rules, the laws that govern information getting, because we don't get things just because we're, we have that relationship all the time. We sometimes still have to go through FOIAs and often have to, look through data to find things that are useful to us and to, make sure we're getting the full side of the story. So feel like the world of education reporting, it's like, I can't imagine doing my job without also like reading everything that Sarah Karp and Mila put out and all the other reporters, across the education beat. It's like critical to stay, on top of all that stuff. And so happy to be here, and look forward to sharing everything else with you.
Cool. So we're going to take a few minutes now, each person talk about a specific story or subject or sort of topic that has to do with FOIA and schools that they've either worked on in the past couple of years or have had issues with. Sarah, if you want to get started, and we'll keep it to about 10 minutes each, and then we'll have room, about 15 minutes of time at the end for questions, but it'll be a fluid conversation until then. But Sarah, if you want to get started with that.
Sure. I'll talk about sort of recent FOIA battle that I had with CPS, and it actually is kind of funny because yesterday Mila and I were talking, and it seems as though Chalkbeat was having the same fight as I was at about the same time. We just didn't know. But I was looking last year, there was a lot of information being put out about how bad remote learning was for kids. And Janice Jackson, often and Latoya McDade, the two leaders of Chicago Public Schools, then often in their presentations would show these charts that showed, grades dropping and attendance dropping. And prior to this, I never really went after grade data. There are some indications of how kids are doing with grades from some metrics that Chicago Public Schools puts out, like the freshman on track rate, but I never really thought to go after grade data for one reason or another. But at this time during the pandemic, I really was starting to think about, well, I wonder if grades really are dropping and where they're dropping, and are kids being impacted more or less than, depending on what school you're at, or depending on how well resourced your school is, or how well resourced your parents are of the kids at the school. So I asked for grade level data. And the first thing that I got back was that they didn't have to give it to me because it would require them running a report that they never ran before, and that they cited a provision of the FOIA law that said that you do not have to run a unique report in response to a FOIA. However, they had presented the aggregates of this data in Board of Education meetings. And so I felt, and this actually, I have to say, this is a new excuse for not giving us information. In the past, they were willing, and they often did run reports for us, or at least pull, if we asked for information, they would pull it and give it to us. And in fact, in once upon a time, I actually knew data people who I could call and say, do you have the ability to run this report? And they'd say yes, and then I'd FOIA it and they'd run the report. All those data people have since left the school district, and so they don't exist anymore, and I would love to find a new one. But it's something that the FOIA office now is using on a regular basis, saying that they don't have to run reports for us. But I then resubmitted the FOIA, and I was like, no, that's not, that can't be right, because you can't come up with an aggregate number unless you have the disaggregated information. That's just not, that just doesn't hold water. And I said, I'd love to get the public access counselor for the state, to weigh in on this. And then after, I think it was maybe 3 FOIAs, I eventually did get grade level data. And not only grade level data, but subject level data. And, I think that was partly because I threatened them, but also partly because they can't really argue that they didn't have that information, or that they never ran that report. Because not only that, but they did give aggregate information, but they did break it down, based on majority Black schools or majority low income schools. So it was obvious that somewhere they had done this report, because you wouldn't be able to present that analysis without it. And so I was successful in that situation. I think that, we should make sure that we don't accept that as an argument for why they can't give us data, in terms of like saying, well, we didn't run a report. If you can show any evidence that they might have run it at some time in the past, I think, we to go back and re-argue that. I also think this is very relatable to FERPA, which I know a lot of us have trouble with when we FOIA. We get back information with a lot of asterisks because they say they can't give us information that shows less than 10 students. But one thing that you should know is I actually once a couple years ago won a non-binding opinion from the Attorney General saying that, that you can't use FERPA in certain circumstances, that it has to be identifiable information. So once they tried to say to me that they couldn't tell me like how many Black male students were in a particular school because of FERPA, or how many Latino males or how many Latino females. So I was just trying to get like the demographic breakdown. I was like, that's just ridiculous. This is not the type of identifiable information that you guys should be redacting. And the public access counselor, agreed that that's not the type of stuff that we should be accepting redacted because of FERPA. And so I guess the moral of the story is like to keep going back, and especially with like FERPA, to make sure that like, you kind of hold them to the fire, that don't just let them say FERPA and then go on with their lives, because they'll say it a lot.
Yeah, they've. I've gotten that same excuse about not having run a report, and Mila talked about it yesterday too, and they just seem to keep coming up with new excuses why not to give information or why they want to redact stuff. And Sarah, we talked about this yesterday. None of us have actually taken this step yet. We've sort of gone the arguing route. But can you explain what the route is for people? Like, let's say CPS just says, no, we don't want to give this to you. Who can you appeal it to? Where can you go to try to force them to give you that information?
Well, there's really, the way I look at it is that there's really two routes. One is, the public access counselor for the Attorney General, who, basically you just write a letter to them and, show them what you've already submitted and, ask them to sort of give their opinion. The biggest issue that I have with that is that it takes a pretty long time. And usually by this point, I've already taken a pretty long time, going back and forth with them in terms of FOIA. And, so I'm just sort of like wanting this information yesterday. The one thing that I do sometimes do, and it's not worked that well that recently, but it has worked in the past, is that I CC the CPS FOIA people on the letter to the public access counselor, hoping that them thinking or knowing that they're going to be review, like that I'm asking for a review, might, light some fire under them and get them to sort of change their mind, because, they don't want the Attorney General to tell them they have to release information, because then they can no longer argue that they don't have to do it in the future. So, sometimes I think they make the calculations like, well, just give it to her before the Attorney General rules on this. But the other thing is that I'll often reach out to Matt Topic's law firm, and sometimes they'll make a call for us or send a letter for us, or even say, okay, can I write a letter and put CC you guys on it? And the thing is, a CPS doesn't like to get sued or told what to do, so sometimes those things will kind of light a fire. but there have been definitely times that I've had to take, wait for the public access counselor to say something, or get a law firm even more involved to force them to do something.
Mila, do you want to go ahead with your story that you worked on?
Sure. I am planning to talk just very briefly about a project that we did last school year with the Better Government Association, another nonprofit that we have partnered with occasionally over the years. This actually started back in the spring of 2020 when the Trump administration at the time approved the first of what have since become 3 packages of federal pandemic relief emergency funding for schools. And the BGA and Chalkbeat were interested in taking a look at how Chicago and several other large school districts here in Illinois were making use of that money to respond to the challenges of the pandemic. So we FOIA'd contracts and purchase orders involving purchases that districts had made with that money. In the case of Chicago Public Schools, to their credit, they actually had those purchase orders posted publicly, so we didn't have to specially request them. But we compiled all of those documents, and it was pretty obvious that a big item at the time were computers and other devices to allow kids to log on to remote learning. And so we decided to look at those purchases a little more closely. So what we did was we sort of vacuumed all of the information from these purchase orders, including in some cases the models of the devices, and put it in separate spreadsheets for each district. I don't know anything about computers, so I took these spreadsheets to several experts on technology in schools, and we're basically asking, how does this look to you? We were just wondering whether, in what was at the time a huge scramble to buy devices quickly and get them in the hands of students, we were kind of wondering, were districts getting a fair deal? So in the case of Chicago, the experts were saying, well, this looks really reasonable, except what is the deal with this one purchase from a vendor that nobody had ever heard of, and that involves older used devices that the expert kind of questioned would be a good fit in some cases for remote learning. So that got us curious, and so we checked out this local company, and we realized by running a few names through the public campaign contribution database that the head of the company had contributed a not insignificant amount of money to Mayor Lori Lightfoot's campaign. So we started asking some questions and eventually FOIA'd emails between the district and the mayor's office using the name of the company and the name of the owner of the company as keywords. So eventually we got back some emails which were certainly redacted, but we did notice that the mayor had sent an email directly to Janice Jackson, the district CEO at the time, suggesting that the district look into getting some devices from this company. I guess the owner of the company, which was really, it's a device rental company, and so it was really struggling during the pandemic that shut down all the conferences and events for which they were renting devices. He had reached out to Mayor Lightfoot, suggesting that maybe he could help the district with devices. So she had forwarded his note saying that she had met him during her campaign. He was a really good guy and a generous guy, and maybe he could help the district. I also noticed in that email exchange that the district had shared with the company its specifications for devices, which was something that I hadn't thought about to look at as I was trying to gauge whether this purchase made sense. So I FOIA'd that document, and again, with a little help from the experts who were able to show that a lot of the devices that the district bought from this company did not, in fact, meet their own requirements for computers and other technology. And then we were really struggling to find out where these devices went. So I think the last FOIA that I put in, we asked for basically a distribution log that would show where these devices had ended up. And that ended up being really helpful because it pointed us to the devices had gone in kind of small batches to a number of both district-run and charter schools. We were able to find out, in large part thanks to that log, that at least a couple of charter schools had received computers bought from this company that didn't have cameras or microphones, and so are pretty much useless for remote learning. We are also able to see that more than a third of the devices were still sitting in a warehouse. All those, by that point, it was probably 6 or 7 months after the purchase, which kind of seemed to throw into question the main argument the district had made for making that purchase, which was that they were really scrambling to find devices quickly and get them to students because there was such an urgent need. So our story ran last winter, and the district's inspector general has been doing an investigation since then to find out a little bit more about whether the district's rules for purchasing essentially were followed in this situation.
And Mila, you touched on this, and obviously this is part of it, but can you explain a little bit more just the difficulties with FOIAing for communication and finding things in email, texts, anything else? Is it common for us to find stories and communications, or for us to get unredacted communications?
Right. I think it's definitely challenging. In my experience, in my fairly limited experience, I should say, having done this for just under 2 years now, requesting emails from both the mayor's office and CPS, you will find that oftentimes they're heavily redacted, and the explanation is that those communications reflect, as the district puts it, pre-decisional intra-office communications. So there is an exemption in FOIA that essentially allows public entities to redact communication that happened as they were debating whether or not to do something, which as you can imagine, this can apply really broadly. You could argue that just the wide range of exchanges between officials involve them building up to making some kind of a decision. I still think helpful occasionally because, you will chance upon helpful information, and sometimes it's just helpful to get a sense of the volume and the timeline of communication between various people. I'm not sure if I have a great example of that, but it also can be helpful. I've found that helpful with the mayor's office, especially to request a log of the emails ahead of time, so you can take a look, and based on the dates and the subject lines and who the officials exchanging emails are, help you really narrow down what you eventually want to request, so you can make it more manageable for both the public agency and for you.
I think, and maybe this is from a case that you guys have, but I think that someone is trying to challenge this. I think maybe through Matt Topic's office, there is a challenge to this pre-decisional correspondence. And so I think if people come upon it, I know at one point I shared some information that one of the emails that I got from, which was like 85 pages, of which like 12 were not redacted, and they were like, what wasn't redacted was like public, it was like a newspaper article that was published, which is like, okay. So I think that, I really think this needs to be challenged, and I also think that it might even be something that we want to try and talk to the Attorney General or somebody to try and change the FOIA law to make it more specific, because I feel like everything is pre-decisional. Yes. Right? I mean, and the thing is, like, you see no correspondence. I mean, you see so little, because and I actually, my suspicion is that when you got that, somebody from CPS wanted you guys to have that, perhaps to cover their asses, and that's how you got it. And that's just my being very conspiratorial and suspicious, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to speculate. Maybe after this panel we could, but I will say that when Janice Jackson after Janice Jackson received that email, I can't remember if she shared it and forwarded it, or if other top officials in the district were copied on it. They exchanged several emails essentially reacting to this note from the mayor, and I really wanted to see what they said, but those were completely their responses. Their discussion amongst themselves of what the mayor was suggested was completely redacted. And we had also pretty much put in a very similar request to the mayor's office, and we did not get that email. I can't remember if it was redacted or just didn't make it in there. But I think we were only able to get it through that CPS request.
We can come back to this conversation at the end in questions, but I want to give Pavlyn a chance to talk about his topic for 10-ish minutes, and then we have plenty of questions. If you have any questions, keep them coming in the chat or the Q&A. But Pavlyn, take it away.
Yeah, I also definitely wonder how much strategy goes into what's released and what's not, and a lot of those exemptions are sort of interpreted as like as applicable, or as the case needs. The example I wanted to talk about today also goes. It was related to something I ended up bringing to the public access counselor, and ultimately getting the documents through them. So it's related to what we were talking about. So as a union, we represent charter schools as well. We represent actually about a quarter of the charter schools in the district. So a lot of my FOIAs are also being sent to charter schools. And actually, like, the history of that, things have gotten better with FOIA charter schools. Charter schools are defined under the under the FOIA law. They're required to be responsive to FOIA, but they were definitely they're still harder to get documents from. But I remember years ago there were a bunch of news stories about trying to FOIA charters and getting just complete denials, and there have been several things, I believe decisions from people going to the public access counselor winning and getting documents that have like sort of created this track record so that charters have become more responsive. There's also been legislation, in fact, because there's a subtype of school called a contract school, which we also represent a school at, and those were specifically not included in the language of the FOIA law, and so they were not actually covered up until just, I'd say, maybe 3-4 years ago when legislation was passed to change that. So, it's sort of like still a work in progress to ensure that schools that are like public schools, they're listed as CPS schools, they get public funding, that their documents and their activities are, actually covered. So in this example, I was trying to get information from a charter network that is essentially this like nested hierarchy where the charter holder governs multiple schools, almost a dozen, and essentially has management organizations managing, operating different sets of their schools. And the main charter holder also directly manages a couple, but the majority are operated through these school management organizations. And so we represent a couple of the ones that are directly operated under the charter holder through an organization that's a little bit separated, but I'm not going to get into the details of that. But so I FOIA'd for all the schools. I wanted to get budget and position information, which is fairly routine. Like, this wasn't a FOIA for like data sets or anything, like just very routine information that for the district is actually already accessible on the public facing website. So I was FOIAing all the different schools within this organization, and the school management organizations, when I FOIA'd them, their response, the two of them, was that they were not public entities. The FOIA law did not apply to them, and that the documents I was requesting, because they were not public entities, that the documents I was requesting were not public documents. I wasn't like too surprised by that response, but I'd either already FOIA'd the charter holder itself, or maybe like right after that, I FOIA'd the charter holder, and the charter holder gave me the documents for the charters they directly represented, but their response for the other schools, the ones that they hold the charter to but don't directly manage, was that they did not possess the records that I was requesting, and therefore they could not comply with the FOIA, and essentially tough luck. So I'm in this position where public documents are the organization that's sort of directly being interpreted as the FOIA law applying to, saying they don't possess the documents, and then the organization that possesses them, being able to say the law doesn't apply to them, right? So I took this to the public access counselor, fairly sort of standard procedure. You take your correspondence, package it up into your email, explain your position briefly, and send it to the public access counselor. I took the denial from the charter holder and sent that to the PAC. I didn't take the denial from the SMOs. I think at the time I sort of saw that as probably like just like a losing cause, because I think they're functionally like not the charter holder, and I didn't want to enter a process that I didn't think I'd necessarily win. In retrospect, I probably should have done both, but I pursued the one with the charter holder, and the PAC, what they do is they send a follow up to the entity that I'm trying to get the documents from, and then they forward that to you, so you kind of see the chain of correspondence, and probably within a month, I got the follow-up, and what the PAC had done is they had requested that the charter holder explain their position, explain, why it is that these documents were not public or were not in their possession. Sort of explain like how it is that they're not in their possession. Explain the contractual relationship that they have with the SMO, and sort of like back up their stance. So it wasn't like I think the initial sort of like process isn't that the PAC kind of takes necessarily a stance, but they're kind of like explain why you're denying this. In this instance, the charter holder responded by being pretty acquiescent. Like they said, we believe the records are in fact public records. They didn't deny that. And they said that because of their contractual relationship to these organizations, they require that those organizations reply to FOIA. So they were essentially saying like, yeah, like we'll make sure they give these documents up. But they did, the charter holder in their response, they did like sort of repeat several times in that reply that they do not possess the record. So it seems like they wanted to make this distinction that these public records, like records literally about the schools that they hold the charter to and are accountable to CPS for, were not in their possession or in the possession of these private entities that they contract with. So they ended up, sending the documents to me directly after that. I also got emails directly from the SMOs that had previously denied my FOIA with the attachments in hand. But in their language, what they had said was that the structure of the email wasn't like that they were replying to my FOIA. They were saying that because our client is a charter holder that is that the FOIA law applies to, that we're providing these documents sort of like in respect to our client. So like ultimately I got the documents I wanted, but it was interesting in that we didn't actually, like I didn't actually get to sort of twist the arm of this quasi public entity and have them say like, yeah, we're giving this to you because we have to because of the FOIA law. They were saying it's because we have this contractual client relationship with the charter and we want to like, we don't want to lose our client. So here's the documents. And so ultimately that was sort of like, that was resolved. And I didn't like, I got the documents. So it's not like that I was going to pursue it further in that respect, but I think it also kind of points to like the limit of the process. I don't know whether or not that interaction itself like creates any precedence other than that, like, a charter holder is at least responsible for telling its contracted management organizations, hey, give us these documents when someone asks for them. But I had noted in a response to the PAC that I wasn't happy with the explanation from the charter because there's going to be instances where not every contractual relationship ends well. Organizations might fail on a lot of their contractual issues, and certainly as it relates to providing documents, they might close. And what happens when you're trying to get information about a public school that the charter holder says, well, we no longer have a contractual relationship with that entity. The entity isn't even in the state. And you're left like, the documents are essentially no man's land because there's the legal requirement, the holder doesn't have possession and the other entity is no longer in the picture. So that like, clearly there's still, I think, work to be done in trying to like, close the gap on these kinds of issues when it relates to like these quasi public entities. I got the documents, but certainly like I can imagine there being issues going forwards with like other types of requests. If I want to request some non-routine information from these SMOs, the same way we have trouble with the district, I imagine they're not gonna be as the charter holder probably doesn't have the incentive to be as forthcoming, right? So it just makes me think about what Sarah and Mila were saying about like some of these ways in which we can get the law actually to be clearer about these areas. And in a way, you don't really like have clarity until you have an issue and you have to sue somebody and get a judge to rule on something and set some precedents.
Cool. That was really great and helpful information, because I think a lot of times when we talk about FOIA and schools and education, we're sort of just thinking CPS. They redact everything, but it's straightforward. But it's we have a few questions about sort of, like you're saying, quasi-public private entities and sort of the relationships. I know Sarah answered one question, the relationships between private entities and a public school district. And so it's good to get into that little corner of FOIA work. I'm going to jump into questions real quick so that I'll rattle them off one by one. Whoever feels like they want to answer it, go for it. And let's try to get as many answered as we can. So the first one is from Brenna. Can you speak to the power of FOIA being able to push CPS to have to make more data public than they want to? Just have you seen, after submitting a FOIA, have you seen the district make any changes to its policy, to the way it puts out information going forward?
Well, I don't know if this is like in response to FOIAs, but I think some of the public pressure around transparency with charters probably pushed them to create. They do have a website now that has some of the financials for charters available. Not everything that you get for district schools, and so there's still lots of pieces missing. But even getting like an audit or a 990 years ago, you'd have to go through multiple FOIAs to get. Now, at least those documents are on the CPS website, and I think that's a combination of FOIA, of people bringing up at board meetings and issues of transparency. Like public pressure around this stuff sometimes does work, but it also, like, I think maybe this is like a little bit cynical, but like it also, the district has to feel like it's in their interest. There has to be other kinds of pressures, and so sometimes when the district just gets in trouble, when it comes to there have been some scandals as it relates to charter finances, and I think there's some sort of wider sort of political pressure to seem like more of an account, like an actual district holding account over their charters, and that's helped as well.
All right, jumping to the next question, and I think Sarah touched on this in the chat, but we have a couple on a similar issue. Are local school councils subject to the same FOIA rules as CPS? Do LSC FOIA requests get submitted to the CPS FOIA officer, or is there a separate one just for individual schools? And then, this is from another person, are there any individuals within CPS that you found willing to support access to records, or anyone able and willing to internally mediate and resolve disagreements?
With LSCs, I mentioned this in the chat. Supposedly for LSCs and for any information you want to an individual school, you can submit a FOIA record, FOIA to the individual school. It will probably get sent by the school to the FOIA office. So you could also just go directly to the FOIA office. But, you should just, even if like you're just a mom or a dad that wants some information about like LSCs and their business, you should be able to walk into your school and submit a FOIA. In terms of, what was the second question?
Have you found anyone in CPS willing to support access to records and help mediate fights? Disagreements, not fights.
There used to be some people. They're not exactly. There's a lot of new people there now, and a lot of people who have left over the last year. So it's not. It's not. There's not really that many people. I don't know if you guys have somebody at this moment. I mean, the thing that used to be very, very, very helpful was not really mediating fights, but it used to be that there were some data people who were just like data geeks who would get on the phone and would say, you could ask them, do you guys have this information? And in what way do you keep the information? And then if they tell you that, then you could write your FOIA in a way that you wouldn't have to go back and forth, because you asked for the information in a slightly different way than the way CPS had it, or, you could actually know and you could know that they have it. And if they don't have it, you could find out what they do have. Right now, I don't have a person like that. But one thing that is very interesting is, I think there was something that just like there's a bigger law that was ruled on about schemas, like being able to request from organizations, like the way data is kept. And I actually do find that is a pretty helpful thing. If I know that there's like a procedure manual that sets out what data needs to be submitted, like on a school level, like in Chicago Public Schools, there's like an Aspen code guide. I have FOIA'd that a couple different times, because they change it every now and then. But to be able to say, okay, I know that the schools are submitting this information and this is how they're submitting it. And then when I submit my FOIA, it's much harder for them to say, we don't have it, because, it's obvious that I know they have it because I'm so specific in my request. So it's something that is a good tip to, like, maybe submit a FOIA before the FOIA that asks, like, how is this data kept?
There are a couple related questions, just moving on real quick. Beyond CPS, are downstate schools FOIA requests easier to obtain? And what resources and suggestions would you have for suburban school districts? Particularly interested in teacher recruitment and retention and equity resources like staff, funds, and outcomes. So just what is FOIA like outside of CPS and the rest of the state? Easier, harder?
I don't have all that much experience with the rest of the state, but I actually find that if the smaller school districts that I have FOIA'd or known other reporters that have FOIA'd, it seems like if a lot of times they're just confused about like what they have to give, or so sometimes if you can, if it seems like they're just not responding because they're confused, if you can sometimes walk them through what it is that they're supposed to be providing, and sort of have a conversation. I guess it's probably my, the biggest tip I would give anybody that submits a FOIA is not to just submit it and then just like wait 5 days and hope something the exact thing that you want floats into your mailbox. If you're covering a downstate district and you want some information before you even submit the FOIA, I would say talk to the FOIA officer. Tell them what you want to ask. Ask them if they can, what they can provide. Gauge if they understand what they're supposed to be doing. I mean, sometimes like the FOIA officer is just like the clerk or something. They don't really have they don't know. And so as much as you can kind of like get a dialogue with them, it can usually be very helpful.
I also don't have as much experience as I would have liked with FOIA in districts outside of Chicago Public Schools. As I mentioned, we did some on that project, and I did some FOIA requests around applications to the state for American Rescue Fund funding. I'm sorry, American Rescue Plan funding. So this latest round in federal COVID relief that districts are getting from the federal government. And yeah, I feel like based on our experience, it really runs the gamut to very prompt responses, in part because those districts are not swamped with FOIA requests in the way that CPS is, and in other cases, confusion and delays. One FOIA officer even shared with me that they have to go to a lawyer and figure out if they could share this clearly public application, which actually I since discovered I can just get from ISB in a matter of a couple of days. So I think it's probably the experience varies a lot from district to district and depending on what the actual ask is.
All right, our time is technically up, but if everyone's okay with it, let's go just a couple more minutes so we can answer one or two more questions, just rapid fire. At the beginning of the pandemic, the mayor referenced meetings she had with business leaders. I requested records related to those meetings, such as minutes, emails, texts. I didn't know if the meetings were held virtually, in person, or by phone, and I was told no records of the meetings existed. How do you request records when you don't know what exists, if anything?
I think you probably got to get somebody to tell you what exists. You know, if it's just like a board member or somebody who can just sort of say to you like, okay, what meetings did they have? I mean, if there's a board meeting, you know, with enough public officials there and board members there, then they have to have minutes. I mean, they must. But if you don't know something exists and they say it doesn't exist, then I don't know. You have to prove it does exist, I guess. It's part of the task.
How does FOIA impact surveys sent via Google Forms? Are you able to get the results, get the responses to surveys?
Have you tried doing this, Sarah?
I have not. That's actually a really good question.
I think it depends. Like you have to be specific what you're asking about. They're not going to give responses to individual or result. Yeah, they're not going to give you like individual survey responses. But I'm trying to think like the CPS has done a few surveys during COVID, and you can sort of ask for the aggregated results.
Right.
Would you be willing to send your child back to school in person? You can ask for the aggregated results of that. They might give you the same runaround that Sarah and Mila were talking about, that they would have to run a report for that. But it's, I mean, you can argue with them that that's not true, that they have the aggregated results right there. And so I think that's one thing. Just make sure you ask for basically any and all records showing the results of the survey, worded a little better than that,
Right.
but something that shows the aggregate results of the surveys is what you'll have to be asking for.
Actually,
okay,
I remember reading a good story about one of those surveys, but of course now I can't remember. Did you write it, Nader? Probably Nader wrote it.
I can't remember, but there's been so much during COVID that it's all a fog at this point. So
Yeah, I remember that too.
One last question, and everyone else who has asked questions, I've taken them all down, so we can follow up later. Don't worry about not getting answers. Last question: with so many meetings now taking place virtually, how likely will you get a copy of the Google Meet or Zoom recording?
I was able to get a Zoom meeting or Google meeting recording of a CPS official. It was sort of it wasn't like an announced public meeting, but it was a meeting that, you know, the CPS people were heading. So it was an official CPS thing. They had it. I didn't know whether or not they recorded it, but I was able to get it. So I think like perhaps like Zoom actually is a benefit, because, you know, when they're doing these things publicly and wasn't an actual like board meeting where they're taking minutes, you know, you wouldn't have anything like that, right? They wouldn't necessarily have an audio recorder there. So I'd say with Zoom, if, you know, definitely try it because it's likely that they have some kind of record. I was surprised, but I got the full recording of that. So.
And you got that through FOIA, Pavlyn?
Through FOIA, yeah.
What did you ask for? Did you ask for the Zoom recording, or did you ask for anything that they had?
No, I asked for a Zoom video recording and then I referenced the exact meeting. So.
A lot of times too, I mean, this is sort of simple. A lot of times we might think of like, we need these really complex process to go through FOIA and get something. My first bet is to always just check what's already out there. And a lot of times some of these Zoom recordings, these meetings, like as maybe a school LSC, for example, they might have uploaded them to YouTube, or they might have a link on their website to a Google Drive where they have the videos posted. So it's like, it seems super simple, but just always check what's out there first, because you'll be surprised what you find sometimes. Cool. That's our time. We're 6 minutes over. There's a lot of good information shared. Thanks so much, Sarah, Mila, and Pavlyn. It was great hearing from you all and your expertise and all the different topics we touched on. Any other questions that weren't answered? Like I said, we'll follow up and make sure you guys get answers to them. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Thanks.